Amy Cardinal Christianson is a fire research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service. Her research on Indigenous fire stewardship, Indigenous wildland firefighters, and wildfire evacuations is important to any sort of comprehensive view of the shockingly intense wildfires that have burned 4 million hectares so far this year in Canada, and that produced almost 60 million tons of CO2 in May. She's also the co-host of the invaluable Good Fire podcast, which I strongly recommend. She and Matthew Kristoff talk to luminaries on the contemporary reality of fire's extreme intensity and destructiveness, and what can be done to restore a balanced relationship with fire. She's produced an abundance of work in this field, but I'll just highlight 2 co-authored books, First Nations Wildfire Evacuations and Blazing the Trail, Celebrating Indigenous Fire Stewardship. Amy is drawing attention to realities and precarities that are too often ignored in the colonial state of Canada. She makes it clear that the impacts of today's fire are generational, where First Nations and Métis communities are, quote, not going to be able to participate in their cultural activities on their land base for a long time. While that is criminal, the uneven impacts of wildfires that have been supercharged by greenhouse gases and global heating, the irony is that future-oriented forms of Indigenous fire stewardship have historically been outlawed in Canada and the US and Australia. Amy helps us understand the history and motivations behind that policing of cultural fire. Her research is tough for a number of reasons, and not least because she says even though she's a Métis woman from Treaty 8 territory, it's hard to earn the sort of trust necessary to learn fully how Indigenous peoples have preserved their cultural fire practices. In her words, for Indigenous nations, there's a long history of distrust around fire, with outside people and outside agencies. It's also becoming difficult to talk about the practice of prescribed burning because of the ways that climate change is altering the atmosphere and making conditions more volatile. Nonetheless, the things she has learned are eye-opening and progressive, reaching down to the roots of the problem of conflagration and problematizing things like land use planning and building design from a deeply decolonial perspective. You are featured in Rachel Serra's book, Climate Champions, 15 Women Fighting for Your Future. And in that book, you talk about how, for you, fire was a part of life, growing up in a forest that needed fire. You also mentioned that your extended family are involved in firefighting, including your husband, who's a wildland firefighter. You know, we're facing a situation where more than 4 million hectares have been burned by wildfires across Canada so far in 2023. That's like 20 times the annual average. So I just wanted to start by asking you how you and your family have been coping with the severity of this year's wildfires and how you're kind of processing the sheer scale of this coast-to-coast climate event.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, for asking. It's been a worrying year, I'll say that. I know, I talk about, growing up with fire, but I think what's important to stress is that it wasn't this type of fire that we're seeing right now. When I grew up, we did have some out-of-control wildfire events in northern Alberta, but it wasn't, as you said, on this scale where there's just been so many communities impacted, just so much land that's been devastated. And I think what's important to point out is that, we hear a lot of talking about natural fires and, that fire is an important part of the landscape. But I think that what we're seeing right now through my family's territory is not natural. The fires are just burning so hot and so intensely from fire exclusion, forest management practices, and then climate change on top of it, that they're really devastating forests. And so, for many communities that are having these fires right now burn near them, the impacts of them will be generational, right? Where they're not able to participate in cultural activities on their land base for a long time.
And I mean, in that context, I wanted to kind of bring up this remarkable essay that you wrote with Tara McGee and Elise Gatti on wildfire for the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Hazards in Society. I learned a lot from that piece, and in it, you note that wildfires burn around 400 million hectares worldwide each year, which is stunning. And you say that wildfires still have ecological and other benefits, but they can,
Mhm.
of course, have devastating impacts when they affect people in their communities. I realize you've written about it extensively, but I do think a lot of people lack knowledge about this. So I was hoping you could just give us a sense of how, like, the high temperatures produced by low intensity wildfires are in some ways necessary from an ecological perspective.
Yeah, sure. So the boreal forest where I grew up in Canada, it's called Treaty 8 territory. So in northern Alberta, the forest there needs fire to be healthy. So fire is just a natural part of the forest. And so um, one thing, that's really common is like jack pine and other cone producing trees, like they need the fire to be able to like heat up those cones to basically pop them open so that the seeds can come out and that they can, make healthy new younger trees. So in Canada, I mean, before colonization, what used to happen is that, we had lightning fires, but they were allowed to run on the landscape. So, a tree would be struck or something in like the hotter summer months when it was drier. And then, yeah, produce an out of control wildfire that would kind of, take off it, like what we're seeing now, but it's not the same because at the same time, we are having those fires naturally on the landscape a lot more than we're seeing now. And there's been lots of studies coming out that are looking at, tree ring frequency and fire. So basically, how often a tree would be burned by a fire and still be able to live through that. And so, so we had those lightning fires occurring a lot. But at the same time, when we look at the frequency of those tree rings and then look also at stories that our elders have about fire on the landscape, we see that Indigenous people were also burning a lot on the landscape with these low intensity fires. And so, an important thing to point out about that is that the time to burn was incredibly important for those fires. And so, they would occur in early spring or late fall when fire was much more easier to control. And so people could put fire on the landscape where they wanted it, where it would have benefit, and where they could control it. And so we kind of call that like a good fire, a fire that's helpful on the land. And so by having those fires on the landscape too, what it would do was it would produce like a patchwork or mosaic in the forest. So in the boreal forest, that was really important because you'd be able to keep meadows open for animals and for other things. But meadows are also great when there's a lightning caused fire coming across because the fire, when it hits a meadow, will turn from a crown fire, like up in the canopy, down to a surface fire on the ground. And so for firefighters, that's easier to put out. If it's raining or something like that as well, it's easier for the rain to put out those fires. And so Indigenous people would try to produce like a mosaic around where they live. So they would have all sorts of different diverse ages of the forest. So they'd have meadows, they'd have early succession forests where, they'd have young deciduous trees like aspen or willows or poplars that would come in there. And then they'd also have old growth forests where they would have like these older, really mature spruce, pine trees because what you needed basically was to have kind of a garden around your house, right? You didn't want to have everything the same. Like you didn't just want to have a garden of carrots around, beside your house, right? You want to have a diversity of things that you can harvest and live off of. And so again, the beauty of that with fire is that when the lightning fires or the summer fires would come, or, before green up in Alberta, so before our trees would leaf out when it's really dangerous for fires because it's so dry, the fires would hit and run into these mosaics and change in intensity and severity of what they were burning. And so with, in Canada, when settlers came, they brought with them fire exclusion. And so since that's come, we've had our forests basically have almost turned into like monocultures. Like they're not exactly like that, but that's the easiest way to describe them. And a lot of that is like with timber companies, right? Because there's certain types of trees and ages of trees that are of value to them. So those are the trees that are promoted. But those are also the trees that, carry fire. And so, like in the mountains, when you go to a lookout site and you look and you see like that blanket of green that all looks the same. And people right now really think that that's beautiful and natural, but that's not natural in the boreal forest. And so what we want to see is these patchworks, because when you have that, carpet of the same type of trees, disturbance can run through it. So you can get pest attacks. Fire is really bad and negative to those areas.
It provides this picture of how diversity is important because nature is complicated, because the web of life is so complex.
Mm.
And it gives a whole new meaning to like sustainable resource management. Like it's a far more, I
Mhm.
guess, holistic picture. And I really want to learn more. I want more people to know about your sort of research in Indigenous fire stewardship, and especially, I guess, its role at a time where we need to move in the direction of decolonization and remediation globally. I mean, you note in one piece that, quote, there's not an ecosystem in North America that was untouched by Indigenous cultural burning practices, and that the removal of Indigenous fire practices from the land has increased fire risk in many areas, with frequent low risk, small scale burns replaced by infrequent, large, dangerous wildfire events. So I wondered, if you could speak to or just expand on what you were saying just a minute ago by talking about how maybe Indigenous fire stewardship could be related to this now kind of more mainstream, I guess, concept of climate adaptation. I mean, what is the history of Indigenous fire stewardship or histories of Indigenous fire stewardship? Um, and how is it both used and experienced by Indigenous, Aboriginal, and tribal peoples who have sought to learn to live with fire?
So I will say that there is controversy in like the science community, right, about the
Mm,
extensiveness of Indigenous fire use. I know I've been on talks lately or calls lately where people will say like, oh, there was no Indigenous burning in like the northeastern US or something like that. But I think what's important to point out is that when you actually go and talk to Indigenous people, they remember, like the elders remember times of using fire. And what when they say that there's been no fire, usually what they're looking at is like either tree rings, which I spoke about earlier, or like looking at charcoal or things like that. So like going to a lake and seeing is there charcoal sediment in the lake historically, and then what does that mean for if there was fire in the area, or they'll look at pollen too, and other indicators of fire. But I think like what's really important to point out for Indigenous cultural fire is that all the nations that I've worked with, talk about how small scale the fires are often. So, it's not like now with when agencies do prescribe fire where we're burning like massive amounts of territory or anything. Like really sometimes Indigenous cultural fires can be like a bush that you're burning, be so that that bush comes back healthier and produces better berries. It can be like, the size of your house where maybe you just want to bring up some green grass so that some deer will come to that area. Or it can be much larger and more landscape level. But I think that that's important to point out is that diversity of it. And really, when we go to communities, yeah, they talk about fire and using fire in different ways. And I think like that Northeast US piece that people really kind of still debate about. That my colleagues that I've worked with from there, from Indigenous nations, really dispute that, and yeah, their stories and their history is that they use fire on the landscape there too.
I wanted to ask you about how you sort of discuss, like I noticed in recent lectures, you discuss how meaningful it's been for you to speak directly with Indigenous fire knowledge holders. It's also something you write about, that these are elders who are familiar with, as you say, climatic cycles, ignition sources, fire behavior, and landscape factors. I want to ask, I guess, whether you'd be open to giving listeners a sense of why the insights of Indigenous fire knowledge holders are so valuable to you, and maybe the barriers that you've seen emerge that stand in the way of that knowledge being transmitted in any sort of like cross-cultural way.
Sure, yeah. So I think, part of the thing that's influencing some of this discussion, like, about um, Indigenous people maybe not burning in certain areas. Like I've encountered that too from communities when I've gone to talk to them. And I mean, what we have to remember is that burning was criminalized. And so when you go to communities, they speak about, really heavy fines being levied on them, people being imprisoned for burning. And I mean, even in California, I've heard of people like being killed because of burning. And so it's something that like when you go to a community, they're not just going to open up and say like, oh yeah, we burn all the time here, or like, we did that, because it's seen as a criminal offense in Canada. So the real important thing, is about, building those trusted relationships and really looking at fire in a different way. So even when I did my PhD, I went to a Métis settlement. So my family is Métis. I'm from the Cardinal and Labakan families, and I went to Peavine Métis settlement where I'm related to a bunch of different folks there. But when I first got there and people didn't know me that well, like nobody burned. Like everybody would just say, that, oh no, they didn't do that. And they were all about, firefighting and that fire was bad. And as I got to know more people in the community, they found out we were related and that, I wasn't there to arrest them or something. All the stories came out about the importance of fire and using fire to clean the land and, the role of good fire and how they'd burn and where they'd burn. And, so I think that that's one thing really that we need to remember about fire is that for Indigenous nations, there's a long history of distrust around fire with like outside people, outside agencies, outside folks. There's also right now a worry about like appropriation of fire knowledge. So where people come in and basically steal fire knowledge from nations so that the nations still aren't able to burn themselves, but other people will kind of take their knowledge and go and burn in their place, which I think is a real concern. But for me, like, I think too with climate change, like when I go to communities, they talk a lot about like their worries about climate change, first of all, and not from like a political standpoint or, because they read a study that like, showed a graph of ocean temperature, but like they're just looking at the land around them and just seeing the change. And so that's their concern, right? It's based on their personal observation. And in Northern Canada, especially, like communities there are feeling the impacts of climate change much, much earlier. And so, yeah, what's happening there is that the cycle, like, so basically the timing of things is shifted. And so one of the issues that with wildfire management right now is that everything's based on like dates, like on April 1st, they'll release, okay, it's the start of fire season, the fire ban's coming on or whatever. But for Indigenous people, like their burning calendar has never been around like fixed dates. It's always around like observations that you can see. And so for me as like a climate adaptation strategy, that helps, right? Because you're not saying like, oh my goodness, now like, there's no snow on March 15th. So what are we going to do? They rather look at it and just say like, okay, the time to burn, is now. So let's go and burn. And I think too, from a climate change adaptation piece, another thing that's important is that, well, cultural burning is mostly done for cultural reasons. So like, so basically that people can live and carry out their cultural activities on that landscape. A benefit of fire is that it also removes vegetation, right, that's available to burn in an out of control fire event. So it basically, as I was saying, cleans things up. Like every nation I go to, that's what I hear is that fire is used for cleaning. So when now when you walk through a forest, lots of times it's actually really difficult to walk if you walk off trail because it's, there's so many like down logs and branches and like leaf litter and all these things. And so what would happen with Indigenous nations is they would go and clean that up with fire. So they'd go and set a fire at the right time, which would then burn all of that. And it basically produces like biochar, like charcoal that basically returns nutrients to the ground. But then it removes the fuel that would be available if that area was hit, by lightning fire during the summer. In that way, it really helps to adapt communities to this increasing wildfire risk that we're seeing just by like a really simple practice, which is removing things there that are available to burn if something like that happened.
I want to ask you more about that, but I guess like because I don't think it's particularly well understood either. Like you're offering this context on the history of fire suppression in Canada as like a colonial kind of capitalist practice, and like you say that in one piece that this policy of fire suppression started as early as 1610 in the Maritimes, I think. What
Hmm.
what are like just for people's clarity, like were the reasons for making the suppression of fire a matter of law in Canada? Like, who does it serve?
Yeah, so, I think what's important, here is that when Europeans were coming to Canada and settling Canada, they brought with them, like, your ideas of like the European forest. And so what was, common there. And so I think, there was a lot of agriculture burning and stuff. And I always get that from people, like, well, Europeans burn too, but it was mostly burning for monoculture. So, like burning for a crop or burning for grazing or burning for land clearing. It wasn't burning for biodiversity in the forest. And so that's more what was happening in North America, from what we're learning from nations. And so when Europeans came over, during these hot summer days, they would just, smell smoke, see smoke, like they would go to these devastated or what they would call devastated areas and see, like um that, what would have been used as like, timber for building homes or, for heating your home or cooking or things like that were just getting annihilated by these fires, right? And so what they saw was like a major loss of resources. And what they didn't realize was that the boreal forest is so much different because it needs that fire and that, disturbance in order to be healthy. So I mean, I guess like I can understand, like if you're going to a new place and your mindset is that fire is bad. And I think too at that time, like in Scandinavia, they had like really strict forest laws there. And so in an article by Bell that was actually written in 1888 about fires in northern Canada, he talks there about like how we should be putting Scandinavian fire policy into Canada, which is basically, using guardians and patrolmen to go around and fine or imprison people for starting fires because of the importance of protecting the timber reserve. And he does some calculations in there too about, how much money basically the Canadian forest is worth if you looked at it from a European perspective of harvesting. And so timber companies too, didn't want obviously what they were reliant on for their incomes to burn as well. So at first, it was fine when they came and they would, put in these fire exclusion things. And even when Indigenous people would burn too, they just saw that as being so dangerous, even though they had really no understanding of what was happening at the time and why it was done. It was that whole, superiority of knowledge when they came. And even in that Bell article, like, he talks about like the uncivilized people, like the wild Indian of the Canadian North, and doesn't see that maybe those people actually knew what they were doing to be able to survive on that landscape. And so as like the settlers moved across Canada, of course, with that came these fire exclusion policies and, these forest rangers or guardians who would go out and patrol the forest. And then, in Canada too, we got really successful at putting out fires, especially in like the probably like the 1970s and 80s, I guess was kind of like the heyday of putting out fires. But that was when, it was pretty easy. They could just go and put out a fire on the landscape and, and they didn't really think what the implications of that were of removing fire and removing that disturbance. And I mean, that's what we're seeing now is now we're seeing the implications of these forest management choices. And so now what we're seeing is, even more areas burning, fires that are impossible to put out as they move across the landscape.
Yeah, and that, brings us to the inescapable problem, right, that we now face, that these extreme wildfire events are becoming more and more common. You spell this out in stark detail. You write, the 2018 Camp Fire in Northern California showed extreme fire behavior and burned approximately 62,000 acres or hectares In Australia, the 2019 to 2020 fire season, referred to as the
Hmm.
Black Summer fires, burned an unimaginable 18.6 million hectares in Australia's warmest year on record. We're also seeing extreme wildfires in weird places like the Brazilian rainforest, the Arctic Circle, and here in Nova Scotia. When like wildfires now account for a huge percentage of carbon emissions. I mean, New Scientist reported
Hmm.
that countrywide fires in Canada produce 55 million tons of CO2 in May alone, more than double
Hmm.
the carbon emitted by wildfires in any May fire season. So it's just like, it's hard to imagine a way out of this. And I know that I read that you and your family kept trapping lines near Fort McMurray in northern Alberta, but left because like the tar sands complex was contaminating and dominating the landscape. People are trying to flee the impacts of like fossil fuel infrastructure, oil and gas development, but it's becoming harder and harder to escape. There is basically no escaping climate change. And so, you know, um, I don't even know how to ask the question, but how do we argue for sustainable resource management now? What does a radical approach to sustainable resource management look like in light of these changes in historical fire behavior and fire regimes in all of these different areas?
Yeah, so I think, with this fire season too, I've been feeling depressed like that too. Like, how are we going to get out of this? But I think for me, one thing that's really come through is that, like, I think that the public, there's so many things going on in a person's day-to-day life, right? And so, if you're living in a city, like forest health or like, wildfires probably isn't top of your priority list for like, things that you're gonna, raise your voice about, I guess. But I think what's happened is that, after, like at first in Canada, like I was doing this kind of, well, I would say like academically alone for like 10 years. There was obviously communities and nations doing this work and advocating it, but there wasn't much attention, I guess, even from wildfire agencies about what was, about cultural fire and what it could do for climate change adaptation and making communities safer. But when 20 like when we had the 2017 and 2018 fires in British Columbia and the fire in Fort McMurray in 2016 as well, that really caught the attention of a lot of people because a lot were now being impacted by fires that maybe previously wouldn't have been. And I think that we're in the same place this year, that like tons of Canadians, tons of people in the northeastern US, have been smoked out. And I think that's one thing about fires too, is that, the impact, like a flooding event or something, isn't just localized. Like, because fire smoke can travel so far, you can really be, hundreds of kilometers from a fire and still be very heavily impacted by it. And I think for me, what I've seen is a real interest in Indigenous practices, and looking at different types of management systems and like how we can move on these things. And so for me, it's like tragic in a way that like, when settlers first came 200 or what, like, and started really implementing their policies about 200 years ago in Canada, like that they didn't listen then and are like, now after this long of mistakes, listening. And so that's very depressing. I won't lie about that, but I think I am like happy now to see more of an interest in this area. And there's some really hopeful signs I see in terms of like guardian programs. Like in Canada, there's been large commitments for funding land guardian programs, and we're hoping that we can get fire incorporated into those as well, where people are really out on the land like year after year, putting these practices into place. And so yeah, I think like I do get depressed about like the emissions, and I think that right now, we're unfortunately entering this really negative loop where, it's hot, dry, so more is burning, which is producing more carbon. And then because of that, also we're getting like more lightning, which is producing more fires as well. So there's all sorts of research just pointing to like, this feedback circle where things are just going to start accelerating. But I don't know, I try to be like hopeful and to look at like these small pockets of like resistance and change. And one thing like on our land, like we burn, And we don't burn as much as we should because we have two really young kids that do not like fire or like, sitting there while we're burning, because it's not like a super exciting adrenaline pumping practice, right? Like cultural fire is slow, and it's like, walking with the fire along the landscape. And so
Hmm.
yeah, it's just, for me, it's a calming thing, right? Getting out there and doing it. But yeah, for like a 7-year-old, it's less than exciting. But anyways, when we're out there burning, like I just went out there last week to the area that we burn this spring, and you can just see the health of the land. And there were like butterflies everywhere, and like pollinators and other things. And it was just like so neat to just, and I just imagine like if we had that, internationally, where we had Indigenous people like managing small areas of land. And there's lots of research that's come out about how Indigenous people, like in lands that we manage, increase the biodiversity substantially. And I hope too, like with these, like in terms of the emissions, that I think more and more people are talking about like, greener energy. And in, especially even where I live, like I live in Rocky Mountain House, which is probably like a very, very conservative part of Canada, that's very pro oil and gas. But even in recent years, like the vote for like Green Party or like NDP has increased substantially. And then there's people now that have like solar panel houses. We see electric cars driving around town and stuff. So I don't know, I'm hopeful that way. But for me, what's really sad is that it's taken these big like events that have impacted millions of people to
Hmm.
kind of get people thinking of living more sustainably.
Yeah, I mean, that's my feeling as well. That, in Nova Scotia, it seems to have taken people witnessing something they had never seen before to move in that
Yeah.
direction. But it is obviously a warning sign and a wake-up call. And I like that you sort of pair that in your thinking and your approach to the crisis by, focusing on like joy, these moments of joy and peace and togetherness, like you obviously like leave room for those important emotions. Um, and I think like that is ultimately what drives people. It's not so much the fear, because the fear is it can be immobilizing.
Hmm.
It is how you translate that wake up call into something like action. And so the massive plumes of smoke are a wake up call as they drift across the country and down into the United States. But there's weird wake up calls that accompany that, like certain whole areas of California being uninsurable, right? Like these are like
Yeah.
economic
Hmm.
realities that are also sobering. And one of the things you're really clear on is that it's hard to communicate the real economic cost of wildfires, these massive extreme climate events. So maybe it's more important to just try and be forward thinking in response to that reality. Like there is this idea in your work that a wildfire provides an opportunity for residents of an area to like implement, if we can't, like immediately stop what's coming, like at least adapt in ways that when we're rebuilding, that develop resilience, right?
Hmm.
And yet, to do that effectively, and I think we're facing that in Nova Scotia, you have to counteract a powerful desire to return to normal as quickly as
Hmm.
possible. So yeah, we can't miss these opportunities, but that means trying to convince people to like resist that maybe normal desire to return to normal, even if it's not working. Um, do you have any sense of like, yeah, I don't know, the magic answer of how do you reach down to the roots of that problem to problematize something like land use planning and building design? I mean, you talk about how that's often considered the most significant power granted to local governments, and yet it's somehow also one of the least adopted community wildfire mitigation measures. So, how do you think we pull in that direction, and what stands in the way of like more serious and forward-thinking land use planning and resilient building design?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I wish that I had a great answer for it. I think, like you said, I think that what's really going to push in this area, like I wish it was out of the goodness of people's hearts and, just realizing that this isn't a good way to live. Like for the Fort McMurray fire, for example, once that fire went through, and we have lots of other research in Canada that shows like that people just want that return to normal after. So like, they think that, okay, well, now the fires come through, we're safe. Or they think like the other perspective that we often hear is like people that were so like frightened by the fire, they'll just say, like, well, I saw it and my home burnt and there's nothing I can do. Like, so a total fatalistic approach as well. But I honestly think that what will happen is probably have to happen is like this kind of monetary impact, and a lot will be related to insurance. And so I think, in California, unfortunately, in many ways, California is leading in some of these areas. Like they've just been instituting new laws about cultural fire and prescribed fire. But then also with this big insurance change there, and we'll see what the implications of that are for local governments, because, it's going to really impact home prices and other things. And then, the taxes that they're taking in when homes basically aren't insurable, and, are in very high wildfire risk areas. So yeah, I wish it didn't take that, but I think that, it's probably like from what we've seen, we've done studies on, motivation for change. And even in Fort Mac, we were looking at, were people rebuilding fire smart, like after the fire had gone through. And what we heard for a lot of people is that, some were a little bit, but not a lot, because it was mostly related to cost. So like, why would you put like spend part of your insurance settlement from your home burning on like hardy board siding for your housing and a metal roof, when you could like instead just put on vinyl siding and shingles and then have like, granite countertops in your kitchen, and or like a much more fancier kitchen or interior of your home. And so I think, yeah, unfortunately, until things like that change, but again, I think these extreme events are pushing that way. Like we've seen it this year. We've already had lots of homes and structures in Canada with this fire season. And I mean, we're only like in June, right? So lots of the home loss, especially in BC, has occurred historically in July and August. And September is really when their fire season picks up there.
Yeah, I mean, there is this problem. Mike Davis has a book called The Ecology of Fear, which is about, in part wildfire in California. There's this chapter that has the really striking title, The Case for Letting Malibu Burn, in which he does say, like, total fire suppression is scientifically discredited, and prescribed burning is clearly the way forward. And also that, in California, each new conflagration prompts larger and more exclusive development and a relaxing of the fire code rather than forward-thinking reforms. So he's really, problematizing that and talking about how like the way that people have to fight fires is now really hampered by the wildland urban interface and like having to work around these incredibly explosive homes. So, but like these sorts of property-based barriers are different in First Nations and Métis settlements, right? Like the settlement owns all land and homes in the community. So like, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's kind of fundamentally different. I don't know if that's reductionist, but like these are settlements that are also at the same time, I guess, responsible for ensuring the contents of homes. And I don't know. I mean, this question is kind of unclear. I'm just still trying to understand the kind of structure of that in a sense, and what challenges it poses. I don't know if you could speak to that.
Yeah, it's super confusing. And I think like I've even been in this area for like, 15, 20 years looking at, wildfire risks to settlements, reserves, and it's still incredibly confusing about, who owns what, excuse me, who's responsible for what. And so like for the settlements, like they are kind of more communally owned. So people don't necessarily have like individual home ownership, like you would see like in a normal community, and same with the reserves. So, but then at the same time, like when homes burn, say on a reserve, it's basically like Indigenous Services Canada or the federal government then that has to step up and like replace those homes. And there's already such like a housing crisis on reserves and settlements with, there's already not enough money being provided for housing. There's already overcrowded homes. So that when you have a wildfire or something coming in, like it makes it even worse. And so for people like, say if I'm living in a home on reserve that was like assigned to me by my band, because you don't directly benefit from anything that happens to that home. So for example, if I was to put like, upgrade the outside of the home or something like that, it doesn't financially benefit me at all. It's basically like me just kind of throwing money into a hole almost. And it's a bit the same with insurance, right? So in the insurance, like if you wanted to get insurance on your home, it's just so expensive. And the CBC, I think, just had a really good article on like insurance on reserves. And people in that article were talking about just, the monthly charges are just so expensive because they're, first of all, they don't own the home. They're like so far from, fire stations. Usually the premiums or whatever are so much for people. And already, like, we have, for First Nations, like, according to the census, they have a much lower annual income than like a non-Indigenous communities. So, there's not, a lot of money basically to put towards home insurance there. And so I think like the thing that also really concerns me is that, like you were talking about Malibu, I was reading there about like last fire season, how there were the wealthy people there were basically hiring their own like wildland firefighters to come and protect their homes, putting sprinklers on. And so, yeah, what concerns me about that is that, it's like with climate change, the people that it's going to hit hardest are the most vulnerable. And so I think that, that's what we see in Canada. We have about, I think in our last study that we did, about 60% of reserves in Canada are either located within or interface with the wildland urban interface. So, the area where, it's much higher risk to fire. And many are also in like northern locations, in that boreal forest that's really prone to burn. Many are remote. And so the vulnerability of the communities is just huge. And especially when Indigenous nations right now aren't allowed to use their own knowledge to modify that landscape around them.
Like aren't allowed. This is the thing. And so, your work is all about like empowering communities to assert a level of like sovereignty and self-determination. Like you've written this really remarkable resource called First Nations Wildfire Evacuations, that's pretty singular. And I wanted to ask you about the kind of motivation for producing that. There is like a particular vulnerability to wildfires on First Nations reserves, but there is also, you say in that text, an inherent right to protect territory and community, right? So, I mean, how did you kind of balance those two things in writing this resource?
Yeah, sure. So I think one important thing to just point out to your listeners is that Indigenous people in Canada make up about 5% of the Canadian population, and there's probably even less that are actually living, like status First Nation living on reserve, maybe like about 2% of the Canadian population or something. Yet it's a 42% of evacuation events are of reserves in Canada. So it's really high, like just that disproportionate impact on communities. And so I think for me, like when I started in this, we were seeing like just this impact on Indigenous communities. It seemed like every evacuation story was of Indigenous peoples. And even during that time too, I think Tara and I both started noticing some of like basically the articles and things that were coming out, and even things that we heard in meetings with agencies and stuff was quite racist, to be 100% honest. We heard one case where a First Nation community was evacuated to a hotel, but then when a nearby non-Indigenous community was evacuated, all those Indigenous people got kicked out of the hotel to make room for the non-Indigenous people. And a lot of that has to do with like jurisdiction and who's funding evacuation. So in Canada, emergency management, fire management, forest management are all provincial jurisdiction. So through that natural resource transfer agreement that was in the 1930s, it basically shifted responsibility to the provinces. But First Nations people and reserves are still under federal jurisdiction. So when communities are evacuated, there's just so many more complications that come into play. And, the federal government sometimes has agreements with like the local provincial agencies to basically handle the evacuations, and then they'll be reimbursed. But it's really confusing for people like, that are actually being evacuated in that moment, for chief and councils to know what to do. And I think like in recent years, it has improved a little bit, but even this summer, like we still see all these like issues. And so for me, it's been discouraging because it seems like every year it's just the same problems that we're having. But so when we started the First Nation Wildfire Evacuation Partnership, what Taryn and I and colleagues had noticed was that we didn't really know what Indigenous people were going through when they were evacuated. So we heard all these agency perspectives, that the communities were difficult to deal with. There was all sorts of like problems in like the evacuation centers, that, it was hard to get people to listen to the orders to leave. Everyone was defying them and staying behind. And so, but we were wondering like what was actually going on in communities, that were being affected by fire. So we partnered with 7 different First Nations across Canada that had experienced fire, and went and spoke to over 200 wildfire evacuees just to get like the stories of what was happening. And so, for example, one is like Stanley Mission, which was in Lac La Ronge Indian Band, so in northern Saskatchewan. And when they were evacuated, like the local nation actually handled things pretty well, but the problems all started when other external agencies started coming into the picture. And the one I remember vividly was because I had a baby at that time, was that there was one mom who they wouldn't allow her to bring her car seat on the evacuation bus, or like any way to hold her baby, and she didn't have her own transport. So what she ended up doing was holding the baby on like a 10-hour bus ride from their community, I think all the way down to Regina, where the evacuation center was. And so, it's things like that, that we would probably never put on non-Indigenous people in Canada. Like, right. And we just had tons and tons of stories of that. And another one was like Deer Lake First Nation. When they were evacuated in Ontario, they were actually evacuated to an abandoned sanatorium, like a mental health hospital that hadn't been used, and they were put up there. And, it was just horrible place to put people. And,
Sure.
But that was just deemed as acceptable.
No, I mean, it just sounds like a policy of inconsideration that definitely like smacks of racism. It's hard to read it any other way when you're starting to see a pattern in, as it were, the data of people's experiences.
Yep. Yeah. And I think too, like when just another important thing to point out is that many of these communities that evacuate, it's not like you can just like jump in your car. Like, for me, if we got an evacuation order here, like we have 2 vehicles, we could just put some stuff in them, and then we have multiple highway access to our place. So, we could go north, south, east, west, like anywhere basically to get away from the fire. But for lots of these communities, they're either one road access or they're fly-in only. And so they're really relying. And then also too, another thing we heard was that, they might have 16 people living in their home, but 1 car. So it's not like it's easy just to, pack everybody in and take off. And so what happens there is that they become really reliant on external agencies. But because there's already this massive distrust, because they're not allowed to manage their territories, there's all of these other issues in communities, and like water, childcare, all these things like that the colonial government is basically, not producing properly on, that then, it's kind of like this just total lack of trust. Like, well, how are they going to help us? And lots of times there's even a reluctance to speak out. It's just kind of like, well, let's just get out of the community and just, So I think that that's one really important thing that the book has done, is just really captured those stories of people. And every participant that we talked to, one of the big things they said was that, we had lots of people crying, even like 4 years after their evacuation experiences, just about the impact that it had on them. But they all wanted to do the interview because they said, first, no one had ever asked them what had happened to them. And then the second thing was that they wanted to make it better for other people in the future.
It's easy, and the knee-jerk response tends to be in mainstream media to sort of obviously like amplify the stories of like heroism, and that's great. And we don't want to dwell with these, more like troubling truths. But if you
Mhm.
dwell with those troubling truths, you learn a lot more, I think. And like you're talking about communities where people are evacuated multiple times per year, like often
Mhm.
because of air quality issues, not even just direct exposure to like oncoming wildfire. I thought your
Yeah.
analysis of the evacuation of Fort McMurray was really interesting in this sense, because when I spoke to John Valiant, right, who has this book Fire Weather, which really centers on that massive fire, he mostly talks about the scale and the speed of that evacuation. But you
Mhm.
point out like there were serious impediments to getting people out of that municipality, access roads out of the neighborhoods, the timing of the mandatory evacuation order. He does talk about that.
Mhm.
So like municipalities need to learn from when they get caught off guard, when when things could have gone very, very badly, and you would hope that people are. And so I think, yeah, like these conversations that you're having are really vital. I wanted to talk about your incredible podcast, Good Fire, where people can, get a really kind of like accessible, often innovative, hopeful, eloquent encounter with people who are thinking along the lines of preserving cultural fire, talking about fire and cultural transmission, and how as I think Biami Williamson says, that transmission takes place in tangible, practical, and embodied ways. But I guess like you're sharing all of this information, you're doing so with this like spirit of wanting to, let's say, build back better, or at least preserve
Mhm.
what all that we can save. But you also mention in the second of the two Don Hankins episodes that there occasionally you'll record parts of conversations that you're not comfortable sharing. So
Mhm.
I just wondered if you could talk about that maybe in relationship to this like horizon of possibility where something like cross-cultural fire stewardship is conceivable.
Sure, yeah. So I think that's one thing with that podcast that everyone just thinks like we kind of hit play and record it and that's the end. But those podcasts are heavily edited
Mm-hmm.
because there is things that people aren't comfortable sharing publicly, and a lot of that is just because that appropriation of knowledge that
Right.
has occurred historically to Indigenous peoples, and so they want to protect their knowledge, and that's rightfully so. So for that podcast, we try to speak in much more general terms. But sometimes when we get into like ceremonial things or talking about locations or like actual practices of burning, we take those out just because of the worry. And so one example of that is like, there's an elder that I know who's like a fire keeper, has years and years of experience in, or decades, I should say, of experience in firefighting, but also in fire lighting. And he's often like asked to come in and like speak to agencies, to kind of, give an overview of cultural fire, to talk about some of the practices and other things. So he's basically there teaching the agency, who then relies on that teaching to go out and let their people burn. But he's still not allowed to burn, like even as the teacher. So to me, that's just so like unfair. And I think so. I tend to be like, I guess, a bit more radical in my thinking in this, because we hear a lot about like the weaving of knowledge and, incorporation of Indigenous knowledge into Western fire practices. And at first I was really supportive of that until I've actually seen like what that means on the ground. And to me, it hasn't been true weaving or whatever. It's really been a question again of appropriation. And so it for me has come down to like more of a social justice issue where, like, Indigenous people in Canada were the ones burning, were the ones using fire, had that taken away from them. And so now that we want to return to fire, like the just thing to do would be to empower Indigenous people to do that and to be able to carry out that obligation, that responsibility that they have to the land. And not just to be, teaching other people to be able to do it. And so for me, until I can see that happening, like I'm a little bit more reluctant, about this interweaving or sharing, or like a cross cultural thing. And so I think like an example of that in practice is like in Parks Canada. So I'm currently working here as an Indigenous fire specialist for the National Fire Management Division. And what we've done here is that we've really been explicit about a separating agency prescribed fire. So, the practices that we often see from Indigenous led cultural fire practices. So lots of times you'll see those two terms conflated, but here they're totally distinct. And it's one of the reasons why I came here, because I really like that approach to it. And so for like agency prescribed fire, that's, where we're seeing like it's based on agency objectives, where they're going out and burning like a lot of land in a little bit of time. So we call that production burning, where, it's because of resources and they don't want to spend any more money than they have to and stuff. They're trying to do as much as possible. It's basically, it's a paramilitary structure where, you've got people in an incident command system that have their specific roles. Lots of times they're using like foreign ignition techniques, so like using heli torches or drip torches or ping pong balls to get the fire going. And so that's really different than Indigenous led cultural fire practices, which are family centered, which are nation centered, where we have children and elders out on the land, where lots of times, because the fire is so low risk, like nobody wears any PPE, like there's no kind of special requirements to be able to be on the fire. We use like more like a slower burning technique. So it's hard for agencies probably to imagine that, because it takes a long time to burn a little bit, but it's because of that close relationship to the land, and that, you're seeing on the ground as you're slowly burning, like what's happening. So when it's time to keep burning or not to burn. And then also the one thing is that there's a bit of like controversy about using foreign fire starting methods right now, like drip torches, because so many of our Indigenous people are wildland firefighters. So they have experience running drip torch, but lots of our elders think that, because a drip torch uses fuel, so it uses like diesel and gas that you're basically dripping onto the ground, that's introducing like foreign toxins basically to the landscape. And so that it's much more important to use traditional fire starting methods. So yeah, I think for me, like that, I personally feel that we need to, as you said, empower Indigenous people to be able to lead these practices on their own territories first. And then we can kind of see as we move, because, we need to manage a lot of land, right? Or steward a lot of land. So we're going to need a lot of people. And I think out of California, there's a really good quote. I can't remember who said it, but it was like, it gets overwhelming if you think like we have to burn 1 million hectares a year. But if you think that you have 1 million people burning 1 hectare a year, things become much more manageable. And so for me, like, I just feel like let's start with the people who fire was taken away from, who have that knowledge to go back to their land.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I really wanted to talk to you. I think you've got some really revolutionary, but also just like incredibly sensible, practical ideas that are obviously very deserving of being shared. And like what you just said communicates the fact that like this is urgent stuff. Like as others have pointed out, climate change may make Indigenous peoples climate refugees in their own ancestral territories. So,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some sort of relationship is necessary, especially when, changes affect treaty rights, tribal lands, and resources that are held sort of in trust. But like that relationship is hard to create because of
Mm-hmm.
significant differences in worldview that need to be respected. And so, that just makes it more difficult work. It doesn't make it less urgent, but it makes it more difficult. And I wondered if you could maybe, like I was, reading about the work that you've done, and I noticed that there's a New Yorker article by Bill McKibben from last year that's titled "In a World on Fire, Stop Burning Things," that actually
Mm-hmm.
ends with a reference to your work. Um, and McKibben obviously is like an ally, let's say, and believes in the need to embrace limits and go in a different direction, a radically different direction. But he writes in that article, quote, "It's possible to imagine a world in which we've turned off most of the man-made fires and indigenous people teach the rest of us to use fire as the important force it was when we first discovered it." And, I just wonder how you feel about that kind of framing and whether you think it adequately does the work of trying to restore like that self-determination that is obviously really crucial when we're talking about the need to decolonize wildland fire management.
Yeah, I get sentiments like that quite a bit from people. So even with the podcast, like one thing I was really naive when we started it, and I tried to correct for season 2 of that podcast, was that people would then just like call me or email me and say, like, I want to learn your ways. And it was like, that's like not the point of it, right? Is that for me, it's like, empowering local. So what I've been saying, like, cause I get the constant question now, like, well, I'm an ally, what can I do to help? Like, if you don't want me to like go to a community and learn their practice, like, how can I assist? And for me, one of the reasons I'm like opinionated about that is because I think like many Indigenous people, myself included, did get a chance to learn from our elders because of colonization. So if there's opportunities to learn from elders, it should be Indigenous people that are able to access those opportunities first. And so I worry, that we'd have a cultural fire camp that would have like 90% allies and maybe 10% Indigenous people there. So I think that one thing that I'm always talking about is that, for allies, a really important way to help is to help to take down these systems that they basically, well, not they personally, but like that, colonial governments have put in place. So, to help like start looking at, policy around fire, to start looking at legislation around fire, and to really start pushing on those things and how we can change those to open space for Indigenous peoples. And another thing that I've heard like quite a bit from Prince Albert Grand Council and Senator Beattie lately up there is that, fire also comes down to a treaty rights thing. So like in treaty, when we signed like multiple different treaties with the government of Canada, and my family from Piacispan was signatories on Treaty 6. And so when those treaties were signed, basically the right to be able to hunt and fish and continue to carry out our cultural activities on our land was basically guaranteed to us by the government of Canada, and so, or the Dominion of Canada, I guess at that time. So what we've seen with these fires is that it's impacting our ability to actually be able to do that on our land. So it's infringing upon our treaty rights. And so one way that people want to move is to, basically reinforce that treaty relationship that we have with the government of Canada, to basically so that we can go out on our land and do those activities. And if that takes Indigenous stewardship of the land and a movement away from, provincial or territorial management, then, that's what's going to need to happen to be able to uphold our treaty rights.
Yeah, and thank you so much for making that clear that this is not just theoretical. This is like tangible. This is practical, and a question of how power structures and anti-fire discourses, let's say, have really changed the landscape, have changed our relationship to the land, have limited the flourishing clearly of Indigenous peoples in many contexts, and have really like imperiled the world. Like it's not an exaggeration to say that. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to talk to you about these things.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.